Okay, good. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. We're going to be forwarding 3 arguments from opening government. First, on why the US has had disproportionate power in the global market due to being the Federal Reserve currency of a lot of countries. Secondly, we're going to be talking about global financial markets and why there's going to be more stability in the counterfactual. Finally, I'm going to be chatting about buy-in into the IMF and why the IMF will be a stronger institution with a greater capacity to bail countries out. First, a few pieces of framing. How has the dollar become a global reserve currency? It is because of the perception of the US as a really stable actor insofar as it had a really boost in its economic output in the early 20th century, and it has been a key player in many geopolitical events, such as in World War II. And many countries have had a great degree of trust in the US that if they have their economy pegged to the dollar, then they're going to have a more stable reserve in their banks. The problem with this, however, is that this overinflated the perception of the US dollar as a stable currency, because when the US dollar is invested into more countries and more countries have debt denominated in your currency, then other countries perceive that if they do the same thing, their investments will be more stable. This is problematic because this dramatically increased the amount of money the US got compared to other countries, since A, they know that they will get a continual stream of income from the countries in which they have investments and debts, which means that the US got a disproportionate number of international loans. Right now, the majority of the US economy is being boosted by loans. Why is this the case? Firstly, other countries, international banks, and private individuals are willing to buy US bonds because they predict that the US bonds will be paid back, as well as the loans that are given to the US, because the US can get the money it needs to pay these loans back by collecting the debt it has in other countries. Why is this problematic? The first and major problem here is that this directly trades off with less investment into other countries and less bonds being bought from other countries, such as from China and other international players. The comparative here would be that if most of the global reserve currency was denominated in the SDP, more people would instead have an aggregated token that is proportionate to all of the global currencies. What this means, that this shifts the incentives of investors into which countries they want to invest and give out loans. Sure, a large amount of loans would still be given to the US, but proportionally smaller, as we saw great boosts of economic activities in other countries in the past 40 to 50 years, such as notably China, India, and a lot of Central and Southern Africa, which means that these countries would have got more debt to fund important projects, such as the BRI that is happening right now with China. I'll take a clarification from OO.
Would the euro still have been formed in your world?
Very likely, yes. Because the reason why the euro was formed actually was because we had a political project in the European Union. We wanted to stop war, and that's why we consolidated our markets so that crazy European leaders have less of an incentive to kill each other. So very likely, yes, the euro would have been formed. Okay, so the second problem with this fact that America had so much disproportionate power isn't that they just got the majority of the world's investment. It is that they now have the ability to form coercive trade deals with the majority of the developing world. That is to say, they can directly tell to countries, either you can accept our conditions, such as that we can exploit your cheap labor and have bad working conditions, or you will not get the loans that are denominated in the dollar, which crushes your ability to grow as a country because other loans are now riskier from other countries, which gives fewer optionality to you as an individual. Even if opposition were to prove that the IMF would be equally coercive, but we will prove that they are not, you would have more options when it comes to other countries. Insofar as more loans are given to other countries, and more bonds are being bought in other countries would have had more stable currencies. So you, for example, as a Central African country, could have gotten a loan from China earlier, even before the BRI project has started, or from India, or from the US. You would have had more options. But thirdly, this changed the monetary policy of the US. Since the US knows it's going to be able to collect money continually, the US has a very, very aggressive monetary policy by which they print money very liberally. poverty. The problem with this is that this leads to wealth inequality within America because the market can constantly grow. Big corporations and investors can constantly rely on loans to build new startups. The problem is when so much money is being generated so rapidly, wages grow more slowly because you have to negotiate your wage with the boss who can replace you for another worker. And that's why in the last 40 years of growth of the American economy, the wealth inequality has tripled for US citizens, which means that even though America is the wealthiest country in the world, you have people who are crippled by staggering poverty. The counterfactual is growth within the US would have been smaller, but the wealth inequality gap would be lower, which would increase marginally the lives of the people who are the most structurally affected by poverty. But let's talk about international markets and stability. Even though the US dollar is somewhat stable, this stability is created artificially by this policy, but it's still not perfectly stable. Why? Because crises within the US still happen. The US dollar fluctuated in 2007 when the financial system collapsed due to a bubble. The US dollar recently lost a lot of value due to Biden's inflationary policies. When this happens, it becomes a lot more expensive for you to pay off the debt you have to the US. Insofar as the majority of the world has a lot of debt to the US, when this hits you at a random moment, like during COVID, this is massive because you lose like 10% of your GDP because your currency is a lot weaker than the US currency, and then you don't have things and you don't have money to finance things like healthcare, like building crucial infrastructure, and you collapse. The counterfactual here is that the BDP currency is like a fraction or it's proportional to all the people who invest into the IMF, which sure is still majority the US dollar, but it's still all the world's currencies. This necessarily insulates you from risk because if a crisis happens in one country, it doesn't affect the others, so the currency is more stable. This is not only important because debt becomes cheaper to pay off, but it's also important because you get more buy-in into the IMF. This is not only because of the economic stability I just talked about, but also for political reasons. A reason why a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries, such as Russia and post-Soviet countries in China, did not join the IMF until recently is because they thought it was a Western-dominated institution and their skepticism towards it. Now, since the US doesn't have as much power, more institutions join. Matt will extend on this, giving the IMF more power to give loans and bailouts to countries who need it. That's why I'm very happy to win from opening government.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now I invite the leader of opposition to start out up bench.
Am I visible and audible?
Yeah, good to go.
Okay, I will take POIs verbally, please. I think PM runs a very generic US bad case. I mean, I think the US is a horrible terrorist state as well, but I don't think the dollar is as bad as PM makes it out to be, especially when the arguments that PM pushes forth are things like, the US would not, we could have financed and loaned more, given more money to like developing countries, as if the United States isn't already doing this. I think it's not to just say these things would have happened on their side. They need to prove why this is likely going to increase, not just in terms of quantity, which I think they do very assertively, but also in terms of quality, in terms of the confidence and stability that the US dollar can provide. I think the first argument then that I'll talk to you about, all responses will be integrated, is on economic stability. Firstly, then, why is it better to have a singular stable currency? I think number one is in terms of predictability for international trade. A single global reserve currency allows like you to price your goods, your services, and your commodities much better without worrying about like exchange rate fluctuations between multiple currencies. Like I would argue stability in one dominant currency reduces uncertainty, which is pretty crucial for global trade. But secondly, this just simplifies financial transactions where the USD provides like a common denominator for financial transactions, eliminating the need of like multiple currency conversions and like conversion fees that usually banks uptake at the point at which you want to engage within certain economies, which can overall just introduce more volatility and complexity into the system. Thirdly, then is on global confidence. When a singular currency is able to foster trust in the financial system, that is when businesses, governments, and investors know that the world's largest and most liquid economy backs their reserve, and it strengthens overall confidence to begin with. Second part then is, why is the US justified in being the stable currency? That I just proved to you why it's like I proved to you all the benefits of having a stable currency. Let me now tell you why the US is justified in being this stable currency. One is just in terms of economic scale. The US economy in the 1970s up until today is still like the largest in the world, right? During the oil crisis of the 1970s, the US had like resources and monetary policy tools to stabilize the global economy, unlike many other nations that were more vulnerable to the supply shock. And this is given the context of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system that the US operated on prior to this. Even with the changing of the gold standard to the reliance of the USD, the US still had enough reserves to like account for this particular crisis that happened. But secondly is institutional reliability, where the strength of US institutions, including the Federal Reserve, its legal system, its political framework, where a lot of financial policies have to go through Congress, provide a foundation for trust. A lot of the comparatives that we hear coming from opening government, things like China and things like all these very uncertain actors with like single party politics and like the dominance of like the lack of transparency as a result of the dominance of a singular political party, is unclear in terms of why they would get like the most equitable forms of deals, especially given like even in the current context where countries do trade with China and do take loans from China, which is something I'll expand on later. They're still held up to like predatory loans that they can't repay off at the end of the day. But thirdly then is just in terms of global influence, and I flesh this out much better, but the US dominant position in global trade and finance allows us to justify its central role in the currency, especially when we look at the roadmap of evolution of the US dollar, as opposed to like a roadmap that we are entirely uncertain about coming from the side of opening government. Now, on a comparative then, what OG claims is that the perception of the US as a stable economic actor was overinflated confidence, and this allowed them to benefit like significantly. It wasn't an overinflated confidence, like it was a reflection of reality given how they changed from the gold standard to the USD, but also was able to insulate themselves against like market shocks and stuff like that in the context of the 1970s, means that the US economy was and still is the largest and most resilient in the market.
Why?
Like the US had the capacity to manage these economic shocks much better. Therefore, I would argue that this is a good thing. But secondly, I'll talk to you about why this is better for global influence. I'll take the early POI. Yeah.
Considering that the SDR is still made up of other relatively stable currencies from Western Europe, which probably includes the euro and Canada, why is it solely the US that provides confidence in it when any crisis in America will ripple across the world?
I mean, literally, Gov talks about this, like your ability to access this currency still exists, but it's about the volatility of different currencies existing in one particular basket, which leads to like which results in like multilateral disagreements and like fractionalization, which I'll talk to you about. Like you cannot just argue like, oh, there are some good things in this basket, therefore we'll just benefit of the good things. No, it's a collective thing. You have to look at it from a collective point of view. Why is this better than for global influence? One is that US dominance in global financing is a good thing. The US is seen as number one, a lender of last resort, where the US through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank has been able to like act as a stabilizing force in times of crisis. During the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, US-backed financial institutions were able to provide crucial loans to stabilize economies in this particular area. But the second part to this argument then is on fractionalization in geopolitics when we have the SDR. And this is when, number one, we talk about multilateral disagreement, where SDRs represent like a basket of currencies from different countries, and every 5 years it has to be reviewed, meaning countries would constantly compete to include or expand their currencies in this basket, which could lead to more diplomatic tensions, which could lead to more exacerbation of trade wars that would have happened more severely than what we see already in the status quo, which is just between the USD and the Chinese yuan, right? But this all in all would have weakened like overall global economic coordination. But secondly is reduce US soft power, and we think like US soft power is good in the status quo, right? I think the US is like, based on all the like structural reasons I've given to you on why the US is like better actor than other global superpowers than the Chinese or Russians, I think we would argue that reduce US soft power in the long term is a bad thing. But thirdly is the POI that I asked in terms of the disruption of the formation of the Euro and the European Union, right? Given that the SDR as a basket of currency would have reduced the need of like European nations to create a unified monetary policy, along with the analysis that I just told you before that countries are now competing to be in this particular basket, the incentive to like economically consolidate would have been significantly low, right? That means you would still have the French franc or the Italian lira competing to be included in this particular basket. Therefore, all the benefits you you want to like you get in the status quo in terms of like the euro as well being like an alternative market for businesses to move to because they are economically well consolidated is something that you can't get because everyone is competing to be part of this one basket. But thirdly, then how is this better for developing economies? Number one, lending gets much better as opposed to what Gov says happen in their world, because number one, countries want a reliable access to credit. And this is exactly what developing countries want. The US dollar is trusted, it's stable, it's easier for the developing countries to borrow in dollars. That is why many African countries receive loans from like US financial institutions. And these loans are often in USD, which allows them to like predict interest rates and stuff like that much better. Secondly, this provides better stability in terms of repayment, because with SDRs, repayment values will fluctuate a lot more wildly based on currency movements, making it harder for developing nations to plan long-term and overall being a more risky investment. The comparative is simple. When like alternative systems like SDRs exist, you don't get easier loan access because you would have far less loans as a result of the risky nature of it. But secondly, you would have countries not being willing to like engage with these particular loans because of certain competitions that they are engaging in with like other more proximate countries, or like lack of regional consolidation, which allows them to like access these loans in the first place. I would argue that we are the side that takes this debate.
Thank you for that speech, and now I call on the Deputy Prime Minister to continue. OG.
Can you hear me? Okay. Two extraneous responses to opening opposition. The first thing they say is that there's more confidence in the dollar. There are two problems with this. One, this is endogenous to the motion. If special drawing rights were the global reserve currency, there by definition is more confidence in special drawing rights on our side of the house. So off-clutch argument. But secondly, confidence in special drawing rights, at least at the margin, is stronger on our side of the house. And in particular, this applies to their argument on getting more investment in different countries because of the stability of the dollar. Here's the issue. Investors have seen the history of the way that US monetary policy has rapidly changed to fit the interests of what the US wants. And investors fear that. See, for example, what happened in Japan, where there was a sudden spike in interest rates causing the yen to appreciate, which then led to an asset bubble. Given that investors fear these types of things happening and invest based on their expectations of where an economy is going to go, they actually reduce investment, or at least make investment more inconsistent on their side of the house. On our side, when different countries are all putting their contributions into special drawing rights and all have their currencies represented, any fluctuations that might happen in each currency's economy are by definition balanced out, because different countries, hint, have different economic situations that are going on, at which point confidence is stronger on our side of the house and there's more stability on our side of the house. Second extraneous response, they say, well, the US Federal Reserve is just a better actor. They can go through Congress. They have more expertise to make financial decisions. One, it is not clear that just because the Fed has expertise, the Fed is acting in the interest of other countries. The Fed has a dual mandate to minimize unemployment and inflation within the US. The US Congress does not give much of a fuck about what's going on in developing countries. On our side of the house, through the special drawing rights system, you are accountable to the IMF, which has a constitutive obligation to care about all member states. And notably, the IMF also has policy experts who can make good decisions on our side of the house, and there is increasing accountability within the IMF. See, for example, the publication of papers by the IMF itself, like neoliberalism oversold. And on our side of the house, if there is more buy-in to the IMF, as Robbie proves in his third argument, then we get increased accountability within the IMF at a faster pace. 2 points in my speech. Firstly, on debt crises. Here's the context to note right now. Many developing countries are heavily indebted to the US dollar, over $11 trillion in USD. The problem is that the dollar is relatively strong, and opening opposition concedes this, which puts countries in serious risk of defaulting on their dollarized debts. In other words, when the dollar is much stronger than your local currency, it takes more of your local currency to pay off that debt, especially as interest accrues over time. Similarly, if you dollarize, or if you peg your currency to the dollar, it's more expensive to buy reserves to maintain that peg, given that the dollar is so strong. Namely, Argentina defaulted on its debt 3 times since 2000 because of this. Lebanon defaulted on its dollar-denominated debt in 2020. Sri Lanka is experiencing an economic crisis right now. Why is this bad? One, because defaulting on your debt causes bank runs in these countries. And the reason for this is that depositors fear that the banks will not have enough money to insure their deposits, so they withdraw their money quickly, which spreads across the financial system, especially because banks lend to one another. Secondly, when you default on your debt, credit rating agencies downgrade your country's bonds, which means that investors perceive you as way less creditworthy on their side of the house. And thirdly, you can't pay for social services. How do we change this? If special drawing rights were the dominant reserve currency, countries would take out debt in currencies which are relatively cheaper. And there are two structural reasons for this. One, you have every incentive to do this on our side of the house because you preemptively want to avoid things like debt crises. Your political party is blamed for it. And secondly, you have a greater capacity to do that on our side of the house because the special drawing rate system gives you optionality about what country to use as your reserve currency. And the reason that you can't do this in the status quo is because, one, given that the US dollar is the dominant reserve currency, lots of trade is exclusively conducted in the US dollar. See, for example, the petrodollar system. So even if countries wanted to do this in the status quo to avoid debt crises, they can't. But secondly, Robbie analyzes whether there's implicit economic coercion to trade with the US. How do you position this argument in the round? One, it is the largest and most severe impact in the round because it causes things like regional crises. See, for example, the Latin American debt crises that happened in the 1980s. The lost decade was because the US spiked interest rates in 1979, making it harder for countries to pay off debt, amplifying all of the impacts they already identified, but also to other countries like Argentina and Brazil. Secondly, global financial instability is more important than being able to access relatively cheaper imports, which is one of the main opening opposition benefits that makes sense. Why? Because but these countries still have to buy these goods. Even strongman leaders want to do things like ensure performance legitimacy to ensure that people can eat. So on our side of the house, if imports are relatively more expensive, in our worst case, that just forces them to spend better, which actually reduces corruption in these countries. Whereas on our side of the house, we avoid defaulting altogether, which is obviously a more severe impact because it means that for years to come, you will be unable to provide goods to people. So our impact is more severe and longer term than their impact, even if their impact is fully true. Second question on buy into the IMF. There are three steps in this argument. Step one, why did dollar hegemony reduce global buy into the IMF? I think Robbie already establishes this, but the key context to point out is that the special drawing rate system was actually supposed to become the global reserve currency in the 1970s. What happened? The US fucking blocked it, which made lots of countries really jaded and added to the perception that already existed that this was an imperialist institution, which reduced buy-in, particularly from countries which, for example, were in the Eastern Bloc. Special drawing right dominance would have changed this because on our side of the house, that decision within the IMF would have never happened. Before I further explain this argument, CO.
Your idea about countries getting to choose a reserve currency is not true because they have to adopt the special drawing rights as a whole. Please engage.
Sorry, that's not the point. You select which currencies that you want to take out, number one. But number two, our point is that the base is lower because it's balanced out by the strength of a bunch of different currencies. So my argument obviously still applies. So on our side of the house, we shatter the perception that the IMF is a particularly imperialist institution because the US making this decision was one of the building blocks for other countries seeing the IMF as this type of institution. On our side, yes, you might baseline have that perception to some extent, but over time, when other countries are contributing more through the quota system and gaining more special drawing rights, you will lay that perception. I see that other countries which are near me and are in my region and have different interests from the US also have influence and are also sending people like experts into the IMF to talk about important monetary policy. I am more willing to trust the IMF as a political leader, and I'm not scared of cooperating with the IMF. Why then is greater buy-in to the IMF good? They say there's fractionalization. One, flip this argument. China tries to compete to make its currency dominant in the status quo through things like currency manipulation. The difference is that on our side of the house, countries like China are more accountable to other actors who are its allies because there's not a totalizing perception that it's US controlled such that countries don't interact with the institution altogether. But secondly, what fractionalization? You just contribute more to the IMF. I don't see how this proves that fighting between countries will happen. But the additional impacts are that, number one, this is an additional way we scale all of our impacts because when more countries contribute to the IMF, they get more claims to special drawing rights, which further avoids things like debt crises and fluctuations in monetary policies, which hurt your country. But secondly, it reduces things like backsliding and increases stability when you have more of an economic net to fall back on.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now I invite the DLO to close out the path.
I'll take a PY from CG for engagement purposes at the 5th minute. First thing, the Euro and European countries, two observations. The first is that SDRs would have delayed the Euro, or the Euro would have delayed SDRs' effectiveness, because the process would have been to convert all of these other currencies into the basket to Euro. Second, competition. If the Euro would have happened anyway, then the most influential currencies in that basket are still the USD, are still the Euro, so it's unclear then why their impact are true to the extent that they argue in their margins. And if their margins are true, the potential harms that we highlight in democratization, having to focus on a bunch of different developing countries and their policy like trajectory, would have happened, and fragmentation would have produced volatility that applies to the SDR. Second, OG says less bonds are going to get bought by other countries. First question, why? Second, it's untrue for two reasons. One, that there are regional incentives in different regions to buy from each other due to physical proximity because it's cheaper, because you don't have to pay for like transportation of particular goods or raw materials from other countries. So there are incentives to be able to buy bonds from other governments if you're in that region. But second, different markets emerging meant that products were diverse in their portfolio in different regions. So different countries provided different goods, which incentivizes other countries to also fund these types of bonds as well. They just buy it in the USD, by the way, they still buy it. Okay, third, objective comparatives. So this is where we explain that having a singular currency is just objectively better for three independent reasons, and I'll integrate my weighing against opening government within these explanations. The first is economic stability. By fiat of having one central currency, we avoid volatility because the most influential policies are based on one country that can be observed by economic experts, in comparison to diverse sets of currencies that would have made regular adjustments anyway every 5 years, which makes the overall valuation of the SDR and direction of its valuation very volatile. OG's engagement here is to say that US politics is also volatile, therefore it's non-comparative. This is untrue because US politics has historically and presently been less economical and more social. There is bipartisanship when it comes to fiscal policy, since the most influential parties by concession of OG are the rich with aligned interest. Secondarily, the people in charge of the Federal Reserve are people that have economic expertise, so the decisions are likely to be effective. And I'll weigh this here. The US, because of military and economic dominance, had disproportionate access to upskilling, education, and innovation. This is also true because they were the country that was the least affected in terms of invasions and wars, which means the US had significantly more resources to develop these institutions during that period, compared to their side, where more influence is given to recovering European countries from World War II and developing countries that were just merely decades away from detransitioning from colonialism that didn't have educational institutions yet. And so financial literacy was just not the thing. I'm a Malaysian, I can say it. Second, it's just more efficient, therefore faster, because the process of granting loans and money is provided to one body having influence. It is more liquid because it is one currency. Compare this to having to take into account the valuations of different currencies to determine the overall value of the basket of these currencies, therefore deterring certain types of decisions. Having to convert and manage different balances. Do you give them one currency or do you give them the other currency when you're actually liquefying these types of currencies to give loans? Time sensitivity is important, therefore, in economic crisis, because even weeks creates a difference in addressing economic shocks, because you can immediately fund projects in domestic governments to address that economic issue if the US decided faster to be able to give you loans. Not having this money immediately meant that under their side, you would increase the time frame where countries like Brazil in the 1980s that had a debt crisis would not have had money for weeks. This timeline is also longer due to the supposed democratization by OG, right? Because they increased more influence and voices within whether or not you allow these loans. More influential countries need to approve in comparison to just one. Here, even if the US doesn't give loans to some people, which is the OG response, first, they needed to prove that the refusal to fund or provide loans would be inherently bad for their harms to manifest in each subjective case, because sometimes it is good. It is good when they sanctioned North Korea and other nations that were predominantly authoritarian. Indonesia was also heavily corrupt, and the IMF was arguably the largest power to check and reform this over time due to having control over economic policies that they adopt. Secondarily, I think that the US economic experts also have incentives to be able to promote developing countries because in the future, they relied on these developing countries' economy as well for things like production, for things like manufacturing that they didn't do domestically. Second, at least governments know faster under our side, therefore decide on how to proceed with domestic policy to address crisis if they are rejected, because the process is simply shorter because you talk to less people because it's only one party. Third comparison, we just get less shocks when loans are given because the currency is balanced precisely with the reason that OG gives. Everyone has the US dollar. When you hold the US dollar, when you get loans through USD, you cannot be harmed by other neighboring countries without collective global punishment and cooperation. So this highlights that you need multiple countries to harm the USD. So instances where countries are harmed here are done with a lot of global consensus. Last comparison. Economic policy leverage in the US led to economic flexibility in policies in exploring aid and other domestic policies because of the infinite money glitch. So housing problems in the US were solved. I'll take a POI from CG before explaining this.
Yeah, your analysis assumes that the US has the best interests of other countries in mind when they make decision, and that's why one currency means faster ramping of loans and more stability.
Debating is
History proves
comparative.
that
The
US
US
has
would have had better influence over these particular decisions in comparison to other countries within proximity that are directly competing with them. So lastly, it's just that the US were fixed housing crisis because they had more stability in their currency to address this, weighing this against the harm that OG points out in terms of like poorness. Yeah, homelessness is worse than assumed predicted wealth inequality. Lastly, in the comparative, SDR systems limit unilateral monetary decisions like quantitative easing versus the US, where they could just print money because of its relative size and stability, which led to uncertainty within any decision that they made, which made it easier to support global markets through the Federal Reserve, which reduced transaction costs, which benefited businesses and governments worldwide because transaction costs increases under SDR, which reduces actual international deals since the cost is significantly more harmful towards poorer nations that would have only made marginal profits from certain moves or certain loans that were given to them. So this is just bad for developing countries because they don't get aid. For these reasons, we win.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Member of government, when you're ready. Speak for that speech. Member of opposition, when you're ready.
Yeah, I just need 10 seconds to set up my timer. Is that fine? Okay, thank you.
Wait, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but could the observer please name themselves before we continue?
Am I both audible and visible? All right, perfect. Starting in three, viewers in the chat, starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. The winning pathway for closing opposition in this debate is going to be simple. Not only are we going to talk about economic stability, and by that economic stability is not only linked to volatility, but the capacity of the country to be more stable in the long run. We're also going to talk about something much more important that we feel that all three teams in this debate missed, which is how do we stop global conflicts from occurring or increasing from 1970s or to the status quo and in the future as well. And I think that is largely linked to the dollarization of the world in a whole. With that said, the first extension from our side is going to be global stability in terms of limiting crisis and reducing the role of other authoritarian actors like China. And this is not limited to finance, but rather making US, which is, we believe, a better actor in terms of becoming a far more proactive actor. And rebuttals are going to be interlinked. The first premise of this argument is that if we implemented government's model in the 1970s, we feel that they would have become far more isolationist in terms of interacting with other countries or making political connections. And there are 4 structural reasons for this. Firstly, US is going, and I don't believe closing governments claim that US is less is isolationist in the status quo, because like these are the 4 reasons for that. Firstly, the US is going to have far less influence because they have far less money linked to other countries, which means that they have a reduced incentive to invest in other countries by virtue of the fact that dollars within those countries are not circulating. Less dollars in other countries means that you cannot get those dollars back, so you don't have incentive to care about the stability of that particular country by virtue of the fact that your economy is not linked to their economy primarily. Secondly, the fact that countries become far more politically connected by virtue of the fact that you have concepts like Riyal politics, in which USA has more stake within other countries, and this stake allows or enables US to invest more in those countries and have an incentive to care about the stability. Thirdly, the idea of competition. So in a dollarized world, other countries can simply come and compete. So for instance, China and Russia also in the status quo like competing, having the knowledge that if the dollar fails, other countries can come up and fill the vacuum. Having the knowledge that if the dollar fails, developing or other underdeveloped countries are going to choose the second best actor in the world is enough of a deterrent for US to become not only more stable, but also to engage in politics of these countries. Lastly, you have a lot of voter pressure. So note, if the dollar or if the US or dollar is unstable, other countries face the shocks of volatility. Similarly, if other countries where US has a lot of stake or investments become volatile or unstable, it also impacts how US's own stability is in terms of their economic and political structure. The reason why this is crucially important is because voters within the US then incentivize or advocate politically for the politicians in their countries to care more about global conflicts, because they feel that they will feel the ripple effects or the shocks of instability in other countries. The problem with government's model is that far worse actors fulfill this particular vacuum by virtue of the US stepping out as per their own characterization. The reason for this is that not only are these countries politically non-democratic, but they also have far less accountability. So countries like Russia, China, distancing themselves from international institutions like the UN, or regions like Asia, where China exercises a lot of disproportionate power in terms of these countries. And these actors are far worse for developing countries for 2 unique reasons that none of these sites talk about. Firstly, they absolutely ruin your local economies by dumping their products within these economies, or giving exploitative loans, for example, giving it to Sri Lanka. The rate of these loans existing become far greater on your side of the world when these countries have more of an opportunity to become a global hegemon. Secondly, these countries by nature are non-interventionist and are prone to crisis. So Russia invading Ukraine, India's oppression of Kashmiri people, China's oppression of the Uyghur Muslims. The impact of this argument is simply that global conflicts rises, not only because the countries that are at the top are more likely to engage in conflict, but also because these countries are less likely to call out other countries when they're engaging in the conflict. The comparative is that US's ability to sanction certain countries if they engage in conflicts become far greater in a dollarized world. But secondly, and more importantly, even in global crises that do not arise from conflicts, for instance, COVID-19, etc., US had an active incentive to distribute vaccines or research more in vaccines in order to restart the economy. That is an incentive that does not exist on their side of the world. There are 3 weighing mechanisms why this argument is the most important argument of this debate, and why this uniquely allows closing opposition to win. Firstly, opening opposition simply mentioned China is a bad actor and USA should have more soft power. We gave you structural reasons why US having more soft power is better and why China is far worse actor. Secondly, notice how this argument doesn't rely on the opening clash and the closing government clash of economic stability and volatility. Rather, it exclusively focuses on conflicts that are arising as a result or a consequence of USA not being a hegemon. Thirdly, this argument precedes and trumps the economic volatility argument, because when you have more global conflicts in your world, you have more economic volatility and more economic disparity, because more global conflicts means that developing and underdeveloping countries are fucked over by virtue of the fact that you do not have enough economic capacity to build your world. The second argument, which is why the structure of IMF disables developing countries to survive by virtue of their inability to deal with urgent crisis. But I'll give a few extraneous rebuttals. Firstly, to opening government, they say that countries can pick and choose which currency they want to use. No, it's one currency that has like multiple other countries in a singular basket. Like, read the info slide again. But closing government says a brilliant economic idea. They say it's only a small proportion of other currencies. So even if one currency out of 10 currencies fluctuate, it doesn't matter that much. It does. Like, even if one currency fluctuates 0.5%, countries like Pakistan, which has like millions of dollars in debt, their debt triples or like increases tenfold. Lastly, the context of 1970s is that you had European crisis, Iranian revolution of 1979, oil crisis in the Gulf. So all of these currencies fluctuate far more. The crisis in developing countries is uniquely important as well. You have a lot of political instability, which means these current countries rely on international actors. You had floods in Pakistan that required urgent aid. You have economic transitioning countries that want to tap into different markets. IMF is structurally low because you have bureaucratic deadlines. For bailouts, negotiations can take multiple months because you need to get a 2/3 majority on their side of the world. You need to get voting power from the upper house and the lower house and stuff like that. Investment on our side of the world becomes better as well. And the tipping point is investor confidence. It doesn't matter if the US currency is good or bad. What matters is trends and predictability. The trend and predictability is more on our side. But another mechanism is that the US's ability to restart the economy is far greater because they can pump more money. So the reason why the US recession didn't turn into the US depression is because they were able to pump in more money. For these two reasons, because we solve global conflicts and because we have more stable economy, give this debate to closing opposition.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Small reminder, please do take POIs. It's an important part of the game. With that, Kavit, close out. I thank the speaker for but now I call upon the opposition whip speaker to close out the debate.
Am I both audible and visible? Okay. I'll start on my first word. I'm not going to bullshit you in my speech today because I'm not going to try and argue why the US is the greatest actor or why one particular country having control over the global economic system is necessarily the best system. But what I am going to tell you is why on their model and in their alternative, they are creating exclusive harms that do not exist in a world where you only have the US existing, where you only have the US dollar existing as a global reserve currency. Insofar as I can do that, I think CO wins this debate. Three frames I want to characterize their alternative of the IMF and SDR in. The first is one where I assume that somehow these countries are going to have some degree of independency. I want you to note, and this is very important, how crises actually work in the real world. Because countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh that tend to be in debt traps can't really have even minor fluctuations, because the point in time at which these countries have 300 or 400 billion dollars in debt, even a percentage of devaluation in the global currency means that their debt goes up by billions of dollars that they don't have. In a world where these countries are already going to the IMF to get pennies on the dollar, we think these minor fluctuations start to matter even more. But what happens in their model, when countries like Iran and volatile states like those in Eastern Europe, whose economies continuously fluctuate, start having even 2%, 4%, or some say in how these currencies, how the SDR is going to fluctuate, at that point in time, even these minor fluctuations start to matter more. So in the 1990s, you had an economic boom within economic bust in Japan. In 1970s, you had a European oil crisis. In 1979, you had an Iranian revolution within Iran. All of these things that absolutely fucked the economies of these countries. So even those minor fluctuations, even though these countries don't have as big of a say within the SDR, the minor fluctuations tend to get amplified the point in time in which the most vulnerable actor, developing countries, cannot even afford to have these small fluctuations. But the second frame, and I think this is much more important, is how the IMF fundamentally operates. Because the IMF as an organization already has a lot of US influence. I think you've already heard about this, but I want to add much more analysis and impacting for this. I want you to note that however 80% of the contributing currencies within the SDR are literally countries that happen to be in either military or economic alliances within the US, such as NATO. Insofar as this is true, these countries just generally are going to follow the US lead, and you see this happening on issues like Russia and Ukraine. And we think this is where we deal directly with CG's argumentation about how France is going, and Germany are just generally better actors. We don't think that's necessarily true on a comparative with the US, because we think all US activities in terms of going into Iraq or shady activities that they might point out are activities which countries like Germany and France actively supported. But B, we don't think they have the economic capacity to cause the same kind of harms vis-a-vis sanctions, etc. Just because their economies aren't as big, just because they don't have as much trade within the global world, we think then they don't have as much influence. But this is where I want you to note that the way that the IMF is structured and even the SDR is structured is one where the poorest and most vulnerable countries don't really have a say. So countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, the countries that actually need support from the IMF don't really have a say when it comes to how the SDR is going to be structured. And insofar as the US has the greatest amounts of voting power, and you continuously see this when the IMF negotiates bailout packages, where the US government has active influence over who the IMF gives loans to. For instance, when the IMF was negotiating with Pakistan, the US actively asked for information about their deals with China. At that point in time, we then think that the IMF is just going to be a worse-off actor. Why? Primarily because now we think you're going to have much more prolonged negotiations. You already see this when the IMF negotiates bailout packages. It takes months and months to come to terms on a particular agreement. So we think all that now starts to happen in their model is you still get the US getting their say, but now that process of getting that say becomes slowed down. So for these developing countries who have to respond urgently to crises like COVID, their ability to respond to those crises significantly dampens. But secondly, investor confidence goes down, and this is an exclusive harm on their side, because these developing countries need investor confidence the most. But when you have so many currencies contributing to how their economic outlook is going to look, even those minor fluctuations coupled with the political tensions that already exist in these developing countries is going to mean that there's going to be less investor confidence. But thirdly, and most importantly, and this is where CG just does not engage with us at all, is on the alternative on authoritarian states. Because we think in a world where there is going to be an SDR, and in a world where China continues to grow as it did in the past 40 years, it is natural to assume that countries like China and their allies like Russia are going to get more power and influence within the SDR. Insofar as that is true, we think this is going to be worse off for 5 structural reasons. Firstly, we think China has actively engaged in things like debt traps, where it has actively sabotaged developing and vulnerable states. This is why we think it is exclusively a worse off actor. Secondly, China literally dictates the value of its currency. This means that if countries like China have more say in the SDR, they can literally dictate the fluctuations within the SDR, because they can set the value of their currency at different levels at different points in time. Thirdly, we think these countries generally tend to have more authoritarian confrontational policies. Insofar as that is true, we think global conflicts are likely to rise, the point in time at which these countries have even more say in the global economic system. Fourthly, we think you're likely to have more political gridlocks, because they have even less of an incentive to negotiate with countries like the US on having unanimous IMF bailout packages because of other places where they are in conflict. But fifthly and lastly, countries like China don't have any voter pressure, unlike countries like the US who have to face the public. Before I move on, I take a point.
So how did US soft power help Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and Palestine?
Moving exactly onto that, which is why I think on our side of the house, you still have a better model in the form of the US. I think one, the US is just generally has a greater capacity to bounce back from shocks. You've seen this when Azad mentioned how it bounced back from recessions and COVID, when it was able to pump out large amounts of money, which we think in a world where you have a lot of political gridlocks does not happen. Secondly, we think even though these issues exist where the US has invaded countries, and we agree that the US is not the best actor, we think this debate is happening on a comparative. That is to say, on which side you have a better actor. We think insofar as the US still champions for democratic value, insofar as at least on an optical level, it is arguing for more liberal democracies within the world, we think it is still a better alternative to having countries like China. But thirdly, and Azad gave you a lot of analysis which went uncontended, which is that countries like the US have an active incentive in maintaining global peace and the global economy, because now they know that they have more influence over countries when you have the US dollar being used. And simply because of the size of the US economy, they are able to ensure that the global economic system is going to have some degree of stability. You saw this during COVID when they pumped out vaccines. Because we exclusively tell you why decision making on our side is going to be better when you have one actor doing this, and because we tell you why alternatives like China are going to be worse off for the global economic system. Please give this debate CEO.
I thank all the team for it was a great debate. You can leave the room and you all will get the decision later on during in the main chat or whatever.